Hi, John. Hi, Steve. Thank you so much for joining me today on another episode of Scouting for Growth. How are you, John?
I am doing really well, and I appreciate the invitation to join you folks today. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So much so. So, Steve, what are we going to talk about today? Tell me.
I'm excited to be here with both of you. We've been talking the last several weeks about speed, and we've talked to Victor about speed. We've mentioned speed in terms of our insurance clients and insure techs. And what we want to do is be a lot more tactical and say, okay, if you're a carrier or you're sitting in a company, how do you move fast? And this is why I'm so excited to bring one of the best technology practitioners that I know of, John Johansen, to help us through the details. I would say, out of all the people I've met in my career, he might be amongst the best in terms of execution and being able to really train others to be able to deliver at speed.
So
Well,
honored
Steve's making
to
Steve's
share.
making me blush as usual.
Thank you for joining me. I feel very honored, John. Thank you.
It's terrific to be here. And I think that one of the things that I hope comes out in the conversation is that, I've spent most of my career thinking about how to develop software. I like to tell the story that I started creating business applications when I was 13 years old. And I've been writing software ever since. And I've been doing it in the insurance world for probably about 30 years of my career. So it's been exciting to get to Oliver Wyman, where we've kind of created a team that's able to really focus on building tools at speed that can really improve our clients' businesses. So it's a great culmination of a lot of the things I've been working on.
So, what got you to concentrate on that specific topic, driving speed, I guess, within legacy environment, learning from maybe the startup ecosystem, startup approach? What have you seen which told you we need to change the way we are doing things right now in big companies?
Well, one of the things that we were seeing, Steve and I have worked with a number of insurtechs through the years, and I think one of the things we saw was that they have these really admirable qualities of being able to kind of run experiments, and almost every insurtech is an experiment in and of itself,
Yeah.
and kind of take those experiments to investors and get feedback from investors even in the very, very early days, and then pivot and change and say, okay, well, the result of this experiment, the result of this conversation requires us to change our approach a little bit. And then they very quickly were able to create real, tangible products that people could touch and feel and react to. And that created kind of this next round of experimentation. Open the aperture on who's giving you feedback, more experimentation, more feedback, more changes. And they were able to do that really quickly. So Steve and I were thinking about, how do we bring that into a corporate environment? How do we bring that into a team of folks that maybe hasn't had that culture of experimentation, maybe hasn't had that experience with some of the new tools, that technology tools that allow us to do those things, to show progress in a week, to show developed code in 2 weeks, and then get that kind of feedback on the process and pivot, improve, change, or stop. But what you're able to do is kind of come up with an idea and very quickly make it real for people, and then allow them to give you that input. We wanted to mimic that insurtech process within a corporate environment, and the management team at Oliver Wyman has supported us in that endeavor, and it's been a terrific experience.
So before I come to you, Steve, there are a few statements you've made which make me so happy, John. This experiment approach, as you know, I build adoption labs. And so that is a type of mindset we are bringing within the corporate environment to industrialize and democratize the way they collaborate with startups. And for that, we need to apply that experimental approach. So before to talk about what experiment is about, can you tell us why this is important? What are the key challenges you have seen in the corporate environment, which means that we need to develop technology, we need to build business product and services in different ways, and how can established corporation learn to actually adopt this approach and this new culture?
Well, I mean, I think that some of what we're seeing is almost an outgrowth of the agile experiment, the agile development process. And that went kind of so far. But really what we're seeing is still some of the bureaucracy, some of the hard to get moving, hard to see progress every week, hard to maintain momentum and excitement because these projects get big and the scope gets very big. And then all of a sudden the bureaucracy kind of says, well, in order to do this in our environment, we need these kinds of things approved. And before you can really kind of get off the ground, you kind
Yeah.
of have this weight kind of slowing everything down. So what we wanted to do was think about what would we do if we could bring in a lot of those agile development processes, but again, this idea of kind of breaking the bounds of the culture to say, no, we're going to focus on progress in weeks, not months. We're going to focus on tangible deliverables very early so that people aren't reading PowerPoints and reading requirements documents and signing off on use cases. What they're doing is they're looking at software and they're looking at those things. So it just is a reaction to kind of, you know, kind of maybe the next generation of agile development, because I know there's a lot of companies that wanted to embrace that, and some have done a good job of it. But what we're seeing is that even those processes have kind of become weighed down. Um, and and there's a lot that we can do to improve business processes by running small experiments. There's a lot that we can do to really be responsive to our business users by running small experiments and then building that momentum so that the project team feels successful all along the way.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah, that's super. So, Steve, based on your own expertise working with John, what are the type of things you have seen as well, which tells you, at Oliver Wyman, we are going to apply some of those techniques we have learned working with young ventures and help actually those corporates speed the way they are going to do things.
I think this idea of responsible innovation is super important. And I'm going to get back to this idea of proof points.
Mm-hmm.
So there's nothing wrong with the big corporate machine because it does a lot of things really well. It protects the risk agenda. It enables sort of bulletproof technology that's very, very stable. And we have a very large client where we have done some innovation for them. And we're beginning to scale that in the enterprise. And we're actually now thinking of this in at least 3 lanes.
Okay.
We have this innovation group that John's working with the client. They're doing some amazing experiments, and it's really cool. And we have the business as usual support group that have a really robust process to onboard new technology, to onboard changes to their technology. And then we've made really good friends with these folks within this organization is their enterprise architecture group.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're doing with this client is creating an on-ramp so that the two arms can talk to each other. This responsible corporate support maintenance arm that's super important to maintain an enterprise at scale, and this innovation arm building that glue through sort of an intermediary, a party that can speak both languages is super important. And I'm not saying that's the only pattern to do that, but I liked this client's idea of enterprise architects because they promulgate standards in the enterprise. And
Yeah.
so if the enterprise architecture group can say, hey, this is a good idea, it makes some of the innovation less scary to the support organizations. And I'm not saying that this experiment to scale is seamless. It's
No,
scary.
it is.
However, the effectiveness, the early sort of outcomes are really good. And some of the people that I would have thought would have been the most offended by this model um, are describing the experience as exciting and energizing. So not only are we seeing some business results, but increased engagement, which sounds, it's awesome to see.
Yeah. It's interesting the wording you are using, Steve, because recently I've had the ability to talk to, let's call them scaling or scale up architects. And so I asked them, why are you using the word architect? Said, you know what? We don't want to be called coach. We don't want to be called consultant, because what we are doing is really architecting and really having our hand dirty and producing something at the end. And only an architect can actually produce something really tangible at the end, whether it's an app, whether it's a product, whether something that customer can touch, purchase the product and services from. Right. And so there's real stuff. And I thought this is fascinating because they explained to me that actually the theory comes from a gentleman. I can't even remember the full name of this writer, but the book is based, the study is based on a book called Predictable Success. And so that is where that concept of enterprise architect or architects, right, the builders of the components of success is coming from. So Steve, John, maybe I start with you, John. How can corporation and corporate executive measure the progress and the impact of adopting this type of culture? Because, when I build an adoption lab, it's all about the outcome, right? Incentive and outcomes. And often people don't realize, because we have seen a lot of innovation labs going kaput in recent months, right? People don't realize at the end of the day, we need to align corporate success to delivery of those initiatives. So tell us how we do that, measuring success.
Well, I think the very most important part of measuring success starts with picking the right experiments up front. To be able to say, Steve just outlined a whole group of stakeholders that need to kind of be bought into the approach. We need to be able to say that let's identify an experiment that when it goes well, we've learned something. And that could be that we've learned that we now have a new capability that we need to pull into our business as usual world. Right? We need to scale that up and actually implement it. It could be that we do an experiment and we say, wow, we learned a lot from that, but we're going to stop because we think that it's not as extensible as we want it to be, or it's not going to achieve those objectives. And I think that we can begin to measure by throughput. Is this process of experimentation actually getting us to faster business results, to faster implementations, to better handoffs, right? One of the things that's fraught with peril in any IT organization is when we go from development to beta test to launch to production support. Each one of those handoffs is fraught with peril. Are we doing those things better? Is there less drama? And I think that thinking through what those early experiments are and really demonstrating to people that the process is yielding that kind of benefit, that business change faster with less investment than an 18 months requirement process with an 18-month build and then a 12-month implementation. With the right experiments, with the right stakeholder team, we're absolutely seeing that all those metrics are trending in the right direction.
So one thing which actually I want to also touch upon that you mentioned earlier, Steve, which is a point that Brian McDermott made when we talked last, is this bimodal, asymmetric, hybrid approach we need to actually implement in the organization. So how do organization do that, right? You are running the business, BAU, and then alongside that, you need to apply this type of experimental approach. So run the business, meet the KPI from the shareholder, but at the same time, you need to build the business of tomorrow. How do we go about doing that?
A few things. The first point is back to the metrics and what's important. So the metrics around the what, the KPIs, the business benefit should not change. Absolutely should not change. So if the business has some objectives, the goal of both modes in that bimodal should be laser focused on those business objectives and achieving them. Where we find this less effective is where either of those modes falls in love with itself. And there's a lot of innovation organizations or efforts that get so excited about innovation that they'll lose focus on the business objectives or they'll lose focus on the other arm, which is so critical. And there's some organizations that get so excited about how good they are at maintaining everything and what their processes around maintaining this amazing level of complexity that sometimes they forget to innovate. And the organizations that can strike that balance, and it's more than a philosophical balance, because we said today we would talk about tactics.
Yes.
It's what tactics are you using to make sure that you have your innovation arm moving, that you have your BAU arm moving, and that they're integrating correctly. And some of those are embracing new ideas that we've talked about and perhaps discarding some old ideas.
Yeah.
And one example is I talk to a lot of IT professionals that think about new development in terms of capacity. So they'll say, I have X number of hours or heads, and my capacity to do a new thing is 3 out of 10. This can restrain the art of the possible to say, I have a capacity goal. Capacity is super important when I think about BAU because it's a predictable thing. Innovation is less predictable. It's more like managing a creative process. So again, thinking about those operational metrics and how do I measure innovation and how do I measure BAU? In innovation, it's a good thing to have lots of failures. And the way I would measure my failures rate of being like a good amount of failures is how quickly am I detecting those? Whereas on the BAU side, you would say, how few of them are there? And that's an example of a very, very tactical metric that can be used to say, even this metric of not as expected or failure needs to be measured, but it needs to be measured differently given both sides of that bimodal equation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense to me. I often say to corporation, it's we don't like in insurance to talk about failure. So let's talk about lesson learned. What do you think, John?
Oh yeah, 100%. And I think that one of the things we're seeing, again, one of the tactics that we've got to create as we're creating teams to do these experiments is giving explicit permission to fail.
Yeah.
Give explicit permission to go down a blind alley, to make a mistake. And I think Steve's point is spot on, and almost where that manifests itself in kind of development teams is saying, we're going to have a 10-minute stand-up every day. And if you've gone in a direction yesterday and you kind of talk about it today, well, we're going to make that course correction in a day. Versus kind of taking, oh, well, we went off on a tangent and 3 or 4 months from now, it's like, wow, that really wasn't what we talked about in our workshop. We need to now undo 3 or 4 months worth of work. But you almost need to give the teams an opportunity to kind of go off on their own, give them the freedom to kind of escape some of the bureaucracy, make those mistakes, but also build in that process of kind of rapid course correction so that, as things maybe didn't go the right way in the last 24 hours, we're able to make sure they go the right way in the next 24 hours. And I think that that's one of the cultural shifts that we're starting to see is that people are starting to say, as they're spinning up experimental teams, as they're spinning up innovation teams, they're saying, not everything is going to be a home run, but we're going to learn from everything. And that's an important part of the process too, is making sure that, you're talking as a group about, okay, this one we're going to shut down, but what did we learn?
Yeah.
I think that's again, just part of the process that we see teams going through.
Yeah, I think also, in the world we are living in, which is probably more complex, more interconnected, but also at the same time, we are dealing with a lot of uncertainty. I think that flexible mind becomes the ability for me of organizations, whether big or small, to adapt and remain resilient. So, John, can I come to you about some examples, maybe some success story where you've seen corporation successful embrace this type of culture to transform their businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the clients that we're working with was having a pretty big struggle getting their head around what a long-term strategic plan would look like in terms of how technology was supporting their business. It felt like there was this Gordian knot of, well, we can't do a little bit unless we do all of it. And when we try and do all of it, we come up with that 36 to 48 month timeline that is a very risky project because the business changes in 12 months. The business changes in 9 months, let alone thinking about what it's going to look like in 3 years. And they really were kind of in the starting blocks and had a lot of inertia. And what we were able to do, again, by running some experiments, we were able to say, let us take this piece of software that's kind of outwardly facing, super important in terms of your branding, and let's just run a 4 to 6 week experiment on, how might we re-envision how this software is going to work for you all. And we did that. We built a prototype. We built working software that actually processed business for them. That was about a 6 week effort. And instead of going to kind of their executive team and saying, let's in our mind's eye think about what it would be to reimagine this software. Again, this is something they thought would take 9 to 12 months to replace on its own, just that one piece. And now 6 weeks later, we're looking at something that is a dramatic improvement and is foundationally more agile, so that as that executive team now sat and said, well, gee, if we can do this in 6 weeks, let's talk about other ways that we want to engage our distribution channel. Let's talk about other ways that we can transform our business, because we know the long pole in the tent is not going to be this really long implementation cycle.
Yeah.
And that was, a terrific success story for the client, because it really changed the conversation for them from one about how am I going to do all this work only to be exactly where I am today, but on new platforms, to how are we going to have this tool that we can now use as a weapon in the marketplace, that we can now take our best ideas and manifest them in the marketplace. And all it took was a short experiment. And even in that time frame, we had multiple pivots. We said, here's a thing that sounds like it's going to bear some fruit. As we were having conversations with their stakeholders, it looked like, well, maybe there's a little shiny spot over there. Let's go look at that for a little bit. And that was the home run. That was the one that turned into this kind of transformational discussion for them. And that's we're kind of mid-flight there in terms of making that ultimately real. But it really has changed the trajectory for them in this calendar year. And now they're really rethinking and really thinking imaginatively about what they can achieve in the next 12 months. In terms of bringing that level of change to other areas of their business.
Yeah, and then you can actually scale it across different areas of the business. What I hear is a lot of openness around collaboration with others, but also a different type of risk taking, which often, can be difficult in our industry, which is insurance, where we need to coach and, help our stakeholders to understand how to experiment and the value of experimentation. Steve, when you actually look at your work as well and the case studies you've been involved with, can you talk about also where you see collaboration foster within, those different environments? And again, let's go back to that legacy corporation applying some, new world startup culture techniques.
It's interesting. There's this concept of trust that needs to be there for collaboration or innovation to occur.
Yeah.
And there's this assumption that trust is an easy thing to get. And this is why we're adjusting even our corporate model in terms of how we engage our clients. Because in this old world, a consulting organization, a product organization would go to a client and they would maybe show the client a PowerPoint. or a
Yeah.
video. They take the client out to dinner and and say, trust me, you're going to have to spend a lot of money to get this business result. And then clients got pretty sophisticated because they said, you know what, that trust doesn't always get me a good business result. So then they said, let's put this out to bid and let's measure what different people are saying. Let's look at their quals. Let's look at different features of this product or this team. And still, that experiment didn't always yield consistent business results. Here's what we're doing to kind of shake up the trust journey. And here's a way to do it if you're a consultancy, and here's a way to do it if you're inside a company. So as a consultancy, we're beginning to say, and John mentioned this idea of support, so our leadership has been very supportive of this model, is to go into a client, and I think Brian McDermott said this. He said, we just got started. So what we say to a lot of clients is, we're very trustworthy, but it's a very rational thing to not trust these radical statements. How about we get started? And then we will trust as proof points show up. In some instances, you will only pay as proof points show up. So this idea that you need to monetize something that you don't trust is a little irrational in some situations, especially if it's a new thing that you want that has very few proof points. As companies are moving into innovation, that you talk to how many companies that say they do Gen AI or AI that can do everything. It can be a can opener. And that might be true. It might not be true. And this idea of being very flexible in commercial arrangements, if you're a consultancy or if you're a client that hires consultants or you are buying products, this idea of, is there a new way that you can get more reliable outcomes and that trust is something that is real, that you can rely on, that's very correlated with those business outcomes. If it were me and I were a client, I would insist that my consulting providers do something better than PowerPoint, take me out to a dinner, or say, hey, you can trust me. Is there a better way of delivering proof points, sometimes by just getting to work?
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. And then if you're inside a big organization and you have an organization, the equation isn't all that different. It's talking to your leadership to say, how can I build a bank of assets that I can start to spend inside my company to generate trust? And especially if I'm building something new, because I don't have a lot of things to say, hey, I've done this a bunch of times before. And then same fact pattern. So as you're engaging your internal stakeholders, how can you get the train moving and demonstrate those proof points in a way that you're building that trust and that you're building the change with a foundation of trust in a new way? And that's one of the ways that we're going to market in a profoundly different way than we were even 5 or 10 years ago.
I mean, it's interesting because you are going into the rational of value creation and building strong relationship internally and externally to build trust. And, when you look at the equation of trust, right, it's around selflessness. So you have also to be geared internally to do things without expecting something in return, which I think it's really, really hard for many people nowadays, partly in challenging economic environment. But what you also saying is probably having strong communication path to really highlight what we are doing all the time and how we are going to yield that success for the internal customer or external ones as well. So, John, we talk about complexity and uncertainty. How do we navigate all of this, right, when we want to start building a different culture of trust and a bit more caring for others to drive value creation potentially?
Yeah, and it's a critically important element of success is to make sure that we're building the culture around those successful components. And I think that it's one of the things that we see kind of tactically is really focusing on transparency and showing people that, it's okay to trust me because I'm communicating with you transparently. I'm bringing to you challenges, I'm bringing to you successes, and we're doing that, as we like to say, early and often, so that, we're creating that bidirectional communication process. And that starts to create the culture around saying, this is how the experiment is going. These things need to be changed because they were harder than we thought. We met some roadblocks that we didn't expect. And by demonstrating that behavior and by having, again, a stakeholder team that's starting to communicate in that way in and among each other, that's how you start to elevate the culture of the organization to be more accepting of some of the things we've been talking about. That's where you can come to people and know that it's not the end of the world if you say, this week we didn't meet what we expected to meet because and here's how we're going to change so that we can meet that in the coming week. But again, you're starting to see some of these themes reinforce themselves, because I'm not talking in terms of saying, here's how we're going to do a quarterly steering committee meeting and bring that up at that meeting. It's how are we talking about that every day? How are we talking about that every week? How are we letting these teams interact with each other as people to support each other through the process and know that we're going to get to a valuable outcome, even if, there's some bumps along the way.
You are mentioning bumps along the way. So let's talk about, risk identification and risk mitigation at the minute, slightly, John. So what for you are the potential risks we need to be aware of when we go into this type of engagement? Because not every corporates are ready to do this. And what are the pitfalls we need just to pay attention to as well, to avoid them so that we can actually start transforming our legacy environment?
Well, I think some of the key risks are the ones that our partners in IT organizations are really capable of focusing on. And they focus a lot on the change risk. They focus a lot on information risk. They're focusing a lot on execution risk. And as Steve mentioned early on, there's a place for that. And that's something that we embrace as incredibly valuable in the efforts we work on. But what we're trying to do is segregate some of those risks and say, we're going to create a safe space that is low risk. So when it comes to doing things like, we've got an application that requires client information. We've got an application that requires even business pipeline information. Well, we're going to do our experiments without any of that live information. We're going to eliminate the risk to our organization. We're going to eliminate our information risk by saying we're going to do it over here in a space that is a safe space. That we've taken some of those risks out. We've talked about execution risk. One of the things that drives execution risk very low is this idea of executing at speed, because you don't have time to build up execution risk when we're talking about this project every week. We're making decisions about how we're proceeding every week. That gives there's not a lot of time for execution risk to germinate and grow in that world. That's one of the things that is a benefit of speed, because you kind of keep things on the rails and you're making decisions about how you proceed in real time. And I think that those are some of the big things that we're seeing, both being driven down and also some tactics to make sure that the risks that might be attendant to going fast are isolated, and that you're going to go fast, but you're going to go fast on a racetrack, right? You don't go fast on the highway. You don't go fast in a school zone. You don't go fast where the risks of not performing as you expect are very high. So we create this, a fence around a racetrack, and we say, you go as fast as you want in here. And I think that's a key component. And that's really, and it's those conversations that establish those trusting relationships with business as usual partners, with support teams, with organizations that are really tasked with making sure that things stay normalized and all they do is work. So I think those are the key things I'm thinking about when we're thinking about how to help reduce risks.
Yeah. And so also it's about, making sure goals, incentives are aligned, that resources are available when we need them. Probably also contributing the right due diligence around partners. Any other anecdote you would like to add, Steve?
There's this idea of comfort that I think it's important to introduce this conversation. And all of us wear this comfortable coat of tradition, of what we've done in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Comfort is, and many studies have shown this, not correlated with business success, not generally correlated with success in general. And there's a risk that we've talked about um, of not getting to your business result. And what we would ask listeners is to think about this shift from comfort to managing that risk
Mm-hmm.
and feeling less comfortable about not achieving your business result. So many executives I run into just might casually say, well, we tried this project and we spent a lot of money and time, and I guess it didn't work.
Mm.
That attitude worries me. I would rather see this was incredibly painful, but we got to our business result.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing this paradigm shift in the sector where more courageous executives are saying, I'm going to step out of my comfort zone because the risk I'm managing is not, did I follow the right procedures? The risk I'm managing now is, am I achieving my business result and am I doing it in a timely way?
Yeah. And so that takes me to another point. If I can start with you, Steve, actually, it's one of my favorite topic, ecosystem thinking and how to develop ecosystem at scale. So you both are working with major corporations, major, global Fortune 500, very well-known organization, but you also are working with the scale-ups and the startups to actually create that alignment. So how do we start building mutually beneficial environments for both sides? How do you start creating, enabling successful collaborations? And how do we help both sides, right? When we start looking at building ecosystem, which is the way to go, I think nowadays, align goal and incentives so that we can achieve all the amazing results and the culture you have both mentioned a few moments ago.
So we're seeing a lot of change in large companies, and some are saying, I'm this size, but I actually need to be three companies, not one.
Mm.
And that's a very humble and courageous thing to say as a leadership team, that we've built this mammoth thing, but actually it needs to be three things. This idea that each company needs to decide, what should you be good at?
Yeah.
And if you're a very large carrier, yes, you need innovation. But if you're really, really good at the BAU and a thousand other things, and innovation's not something that's going to be native to you, that might be something that you want to outsource to a lot of these smaller companies and to say, you know what, you're going to be very good at the funnel of innovation to say, I'm going to find all these companies that say they do this, but I'm going to be very good at narrowing them down and finding the very best innovation that fits my. There's nothing wrong with that answer.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're one of these smaller companies, you're providing this critical service to these organizations that have decided that they want to be very good at so many things, and they are reliant now on you as a provider to be innovating for them. So this idea of thinking of your business model as an ecosystem gives you so many more degrees of freedom, whoever you are.
Yeah.
If you're an intermediary, if you're a startup company, if you're a very mature tech, large company, this idea of just expanding the scope of what's possible to a broader ecosystem. And this has been occurring for decades. This is not a new concept, but it's good to remind ourselves that this is something that's important not to discard, if that makes sense.
Yeah. John, any additional points from you?
Well, I mean, I always like to bring maybe even some technology into this conversation, because when I think about ecosystems, what I'm thinking about is that the walls between organizations, even how they exchange information and how they can engage as in the regular course of business in automated ways, are being enabled in ways, every day, every week, we're coming up with new ways to create really kind of low friction ecosystems.
Mm-hmm.
And exactly to Steve's point, these organizations are figuring out, here's the things that I'm great at, and here's the things that I'm going to allow myself to, that I'm going to lower the friction on how I integrate with my ecosystem. And that's going to allow me to kind of capture more of the market. And the partners that I bring into my ecosystem are going to be the ones that are adding to that are integrating with me transparently, that are providing value to me transparently without artificial barriers, without artificial friction, artificial cost. And I think what we're seeing is that embracing some of those technology strategies is really supporting some of these ecosystems, and enabling us to kind of have much lower friction amongst our trading partners. And again, it does move toward, how do we build speed into our process, and that's another way that we can do that.
Yeah. And so, when I think as well about ecosystem is we need to think about the way we build business slightly differently. You cannot apply the old techniques on building the business of tomorrow, because you already said it, Steve, right? It's about building trust. So even your contracting becomes different because it needs to be a much more trustworthy, based on mutual respect, because we are going to do business together type of contracting, right? It's about really building relationships and throwing new ideas and approaches to see whether we can actually build that top line even a little bit better. But it's also about patience and persistence and taking, as we said earlier, calculated risk too. So starting with you, John, what would be your last words of wisdom for me today?
I think the thing that I'm hoping everyone's taking away from this conversation is that there's new techniques that we can bring to bear to create really valuable experiments that help us unlock business value while also integrating really well into the IT organization that has been successful and is really successful at running the things that need to be run on a business as usual basis. And that by thinking about some interesting experiments, you can turbocharge the business value that you're getting from those experiments.
Steve,
any last words?
The same as I've said before, we love to keep the conversation going, and we'd love to help if we can. But if you don't want to talk to us, my advice would be to try something new, to step out of your comfort zone and see what happens. Try your own experiment.
As I was preparing for this conversation, I picked up 3 quotes, and I hope you will like them. The first one, which I believe you have actually both talked about during our conversation. The first one is innovation is not about ideas. It is about making ideas happen, from Scott Belsky. Then the other quote, which I'm sure you will know immediately where that comes from, is the only way to do great work is to love what you do. This is Monsieur Steve Jobs. And then the last one is the best way to predict the future is to create it. Peter Drucker. So where can we find you? And I know, Steve, I have highlighted that across our past conversations, but I will ask the same question again because, people listen and people need to be often reminded about those little details. So starting with you, where can we find you?
OliverWyman.com. You can find me and perhaps John on LinkedIn.
Yes.
My email address is steven.abel@oliverwyman.com.
Thank you, Steve. John, anything else? And your email, maybe, if it's okay with you?
100%, that's okay. My email is cleverly disguised as john.johansen@oliverwyman.com. And you may be able to find me on LinkedIn as well. I look forward to talking to folks.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today on this great conversation where we are creating that alignment between legacy corporation and the startup environment, but also highlighting why we need to change the way we are working and take a much more experimental approach to achieving great outcomes. So thank you very much to both of you, Steve and John, for joining me on Scouting for Growth today.
Thank you, Sabine.
Thank you.